Hello, everybody. We're going to be doing 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And do you ever wonder why it is that we need a rabbi to cross-examine the New Testament? Well, if you're watching the series, by now you will have already known. So thank you for tuning in, and sit tight. We'll be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 87 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac from Canada. So I'd like to welcome you all to the show tonight, and Rabbi, it's a pleasure to have you back in the studio as always. Thank you so much for joining us here and for your long-lived dedication to taking this road as long as it'll take. Hey, and I say that specifically because, people think, well, what's going to happen whenever they actually finish the New Testament? Well, we're not stopping. We got more stuff to cover. So one of these days we're going to have to, and we've been threatening it. It's going to happen someday. We just don't know when yet. Could be sooner than later, though. I mean, because honestly, there's been a lot of changes, a lot of updates happening this last week with the studio that may project us a little faster forward. And the sooner we get in the studio, the sooner we can get back into a lot heavier workload on actual broadcasting, doing a lot more shows. We're kind of reduced down to 4 a week whenever everything works out well, but we'll be back up to 8, 10, 12 shows a week once we're actually in the studio. So welcome back, and Rabbi, thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, it's good to be back with you.
Very good, very good. So it's as usual. My favorite request is to kind of recap. Last week was kind of crazy. I mean, chapter 7 was pretty intense. And so if you want to just kind of like re-highlight that for us before we kick off, and as usual, I'll follow along with some on-screen prompts, and we'll go from there, okay?
So last week was the sex show with Paul. With Paul of Tarsus.
It was.
I mean, it's interesting that so far in this 1 Corinthians, we've seen that Paul seems to be struggling against a church that's got lots of problems, from personality problems to political problems to just moral corruption, and people that were engaged in all kinds of wicked behavior, so it seems. And then last week we saw, strangely, they were saying, well, maybe people shouldn't be having sex anymore.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And so basically we saw that Paul, in effect, really agrees with that and says that would be the best, that would be ideal. He says, I wish that everyone was like me. He doesn't say this, but I'm like Jesus as well.
Right.
And, remain celibate. But he realizes that, many people will not be able to hack that. And so he says it's much better to get married and to live a normal life rather than to burn with passion. And so he basically permits a normal married life. He again is very much opposed to divorce, it seems, unless, well, he doesn't say this, but in the Gospels we saw that Jesus permitted divorce if there was infidelity. But otherwise, Paul does not really seem to feel that divorce is permissible, generally speaking, and certainly after divorce, people are not supposed to remarry.
And interestingly enough, it seems as though he's got this whole compelling move because he really feels like whatever's going to happen based on his understanding of what he saw is going to happen really fast, like really soon. And we know for your examination of Matthew and the overall gospel view, that's what Jesus' point was. Behold, many of you standing with me today will not die until you see this stuff, right? And so Paul has got this same feeling, and we're 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting.
Well, it's interesting because that seems to be one of the reasons why, Paul is basically saying that, if the world's essentially coming to an end soon, things like marriage and normal interpersonal relationships, are not so critical. Although what we saw last week was that he gave several other reasons for why marriage is not a great idea. I mean, he says that just in general, it takes up a lot of your energy and time and focus, and you could be devoting yourself to more spiritual things. Now that would be true even if the world was going to go on for another 1,000 years.
True, right.
So he did suggest several reasons. I think there were 3 of them why he really feels it's best not to marry. That was marry, and Paul didn't marry, and so he certainly is advocating something which.
Let's see if we can reset here. There we
go. Which does advocate at least celibacy for its priests. This is something which Christians nowhere accept, this idea that celibacy is ideal. It's not just for the few. I mean, Paul speaks about, people that have the gift to be able to live like he does. But it seems like no one has that gift. It seems that it's a very unrealistic kind of, ethos. And what we pointed out last week is that it flies completely in the face of the Tanakh. The Tanakh, speaks about marriage not just as something which is a concession to human weakness, but marriage is an ultimate experience for human beings. Marriage is the fulfillment of who we can be as human beings. And so we cited, at least 10 or so sources last week from the Tanakh and from rabbinic literature showing that, Paul's attitude to marriage is simply, out of step with, what the Tanakh teaches and what our Jewish sages teach. So that's a pretty controversial chapter, and he just sort of drops it at that point. Although we will, I think, get back to it at several other points as we go through his writings. This week, we're going to have a very, very extremely short. I've said this in the past, that it's going to be short and we go on for 2 hours.
That's funny.
But this is actually going to be fairly short because it's just basically one simple issue that he raises, and this is the question of eating food that is offered to idols.
Would you clarify one thing real quick? And this will kind of cover all of Paul's theology again. We've discussed it before, but sometimes I forget certain points. So Paul, and just correct me right or wrong, Paul never heard of a virgin birth, right? He never talks about it. Is that correct?
He does not seem to speak about it directly.
But the crucifixion, yes, right? Just kind of vaguely, or
yeah. What's crucial for Paul is not so much the crucifixion, but the resurrection.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying.
Right?
Okay,
that's for Paul critical.
Got it.
And it's really the centerpiece of his entire theology is based upon that. What's interesting is, and again, this is something which is so important when someone is studying the Christian Bible, is that we always think about, Matthew and Luke, who did speak about a virgin birth. And because those books come before the writings of Paul, we think about them as predating Paul. But it's very important to remember Paul is writing before the Gospels were composed.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to keep that in mind because we sort of get lulled into the error of assuming it's the other way around, because the way the people who put together the Christian Bible ordered the books was to have the story of Jesus' life coming first, and then Paul's letters. But in terms of when they were written, it's the other way around. And so it's interesting that at least 2 of the 4 gospel writers speak about Jesus being born of a virgin. Paul doesn't really seem to get into it, at least directly. And I'm not sure really for him it's that important. Of course, if you're speaking to a Christian who's sold on the idea that in the Christian Bible, it clearly teaches the divinity of Jesus, so they're more invested in trying to show this idea of a virgin birth, because that would be sort of indicating that he wasn't a normal human being. And what I've tried to show here so far, and again, we haven't finished this yet, but I've tried to show that at least in what we've seen so far, Paul is far from clear on this topic. Actually, we're going to have an important verse tonight that sort of plays into this theme. But so far, what we've seen is that Paul doesn't really come out thus far and make it clear that he thinks Jesus is God, is identical to God. He seems to have a position where Jesus is an elevated being, possibly some kind of intermediary to God, but he so far been pretty consistent in his distinguishing between Jesus and God.
So, real quickly, the question I would have now is with that, and I tend to agree with you on that, but I wonder to what level. I wonder, is it that that Paul may have viewed him because he didn't believe or teach anything about a virgin birth, which means he could not have been a deity otherwise, or even a demigod, if you will. Do you think that he was put in a position like Moses would have been with that same level, or do you think that Paul is teaching even a much greater elevation of Jesus than even Moses?
I mean, as an intermediary to God.
Yes, right.
So in the Tanakh, I mean, Moses is not so much an intermediary to God, because there's no need for people to somehow go through Moses to get to God.
Right.
And the Tanakh seems pretty clear that we approach God directly. I mean, Moses is only an intermediary in the sense of the way God uses him to communicate with us, right? He's the ultimate prophet that brings to us the will of God. So in that sense, it's interesting, in the direction of God to us, so Moses becomes that intermediary in the sense that he is the vehicle through which God communicates. But in terms of us going to God, how we connect with God, we don't need Moses.
Right.
Right? We go directly. So, I don't know if we can at this point say we've gone through all of the data, because we have so much more of Paul to read. And again, most traditional Christians will insist that Paul viewed Jesus as God, and I see where they build their case, but it seems far from clear to me.
Okay.
And you're right. I mean, to have Jesus with a normal human birth would make it more difficult to see him as God. It seems that the virgin birth may not be absolutely necessary, but seems to be very handy if you're trying to paint him as God. But we saw that even in Matthew, which we've studied, it was far from clear that Matthew saw Jesus as God, even though Matthew, portrays his birth to a virgin. I mean, look, obviously, if someone is born to a virgin, it doesn't mean that they are God. It just means they were born of a virgin. But it seems that those things go hand in glove, meaning that if someone is invested in believing Jesus is God, they probably would be invested in showing that he's born not like any other human being.
Right.
But so we'll have a chance to examine this, at least Paul's theology on this, as we go through more of his writing. So tonight, the topic that he's really getting into tonight, it's really the only topic of this chapter, is that the Corinthians are asking about, or possibly even telling him, but it looks like they're asking him about, what do we do in terms of eating food? And I'm imagining he's talking here about meat, right? Eating meat that was offered to idols, sacrificed to idols, right? Meat that was used in the service of idolatry. There were plenty, we're talking about about in Corinth. There were plenty of idolatrous cults back then, and they probably had temples where sacrifices were brought to these idols, and food was offered to the idols. It still goes on in the world, in certain parts of the world today. They're asking the question: are you allowed to eat that food? Is that food permissible? So basically, what Paul seems to be saying is that idols are really nothing. He doesn't take them seriously because he says it's baloney, right? Only God is God, and idols are stupid statues, and idols really there's nothing to them.
Right.
And he says, therefore, he seems to be saying that, therefore, any sacrifice you bring to one of these statues, one of these idols, it's like what you're doing is irrelevant. What you're doing is meaningless. He's saying that it really, because this statue is nothing, so then any food that you bring to the statue, it shouldn't really affect the food. Meaning that he seems to be saying that there's nothing to worry about. Meaning that if you bring a sacrifice, an offering, to something which is just nothing, there's nothing to it, then that food should not be rendered impure or unclean. The food, Paul seems to be saying in this chapter, would not be defiled. That seems to be Paul's starting point. It's not really a big deal, and so he seems to be taking the position in this chapter that, in principle, there should be nothing wrong with eating such food, with eating such meat. That seems to be Paul's starting point. And we saw back in chapter 6, verse 12 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul says that everything is permitted to him. But he seems to be saying that in general, that the ritual and the religious and ritual and ceremonial prohibitions of the Torah, as far as Paul is concerned, they don't really seem to be that significant. Paul basically feels that everything is permitted in principle. And we'll see when we get to the book of Galatians that he speaks about this, especially in the 5th chapter of Galatians, this whole idea of Christian liberty, right? That the Christian has liberty because I think it's one of the major lines that Paul keeps on repeating, is that a Christian is not under the law, is not bound by the law. Now I know this is I get so many arguments about this. I'm told by Christians that's not what Paul means. He doesn't really mean you're not under the law. He doesn't mean that the law has been done away with. I respectfully disagree. I think that, as I've tried to show many times here, I don't think it's simply my reading of these words of Paul. I think that what's significant is that you see this is the way that Paul's students understood these words, that we don't see any of the followers of Paul finding it important to observe the Torah, to observe the law. And what's more is that we know that the churches that grew out of Paul's teachings would persecute the Jewish Christians, the Hebrew Christians, who wanted to maintain the observance of the Torah. So I don't think that I'm just out to lunch in terms of how I'm understanding Paul. I think that when he speaks about liberty, when he speaks about not being under the law, when I think he says that all things are permitted, I think that Paul really believed that there's no problem with, for example, wearing clothing that had wool and linen mixed together. I don't think there was any problem as far as Paul was concerned in eating non-kosher food. I don't think there's any problem, and Paul says it here in this chapter. There's nothing wrong with eating food that was sacrificed to idols. We're going to see, though, that he tempers this, that he modifies this. But at least in principle, this is what his starting point seems to be. Now, before we go on, I just wanted to say as a side point, because this is not the place I really want to deal with this topic, but here in this chapter, in verse 6, Paul sort of goes into a tangent about his understanding of the nature of God. And in verse 6 here, Paul says, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist." That seems to be a pretty strong statement of monotheism, that there is one God, and who is that? The Father, and from whom are all things, meaning that he is the creator of everything, and for whom we exist. So that's basically, the whole ball of wax. And then he says, "and one Lord," the Messiah, Jesus, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Now, what you will find from almost all traditional conservative Christians is they would say that this verse is a slam dunk verse, proving that that Paul's theology equates Jesus totally with God. That Paul here speaks about Jesus and God in the same breath, and he describes them, in similar ways. I'm not so clear about that. And again, I would say this is a bit of a question mark verse, but I think that I feel very comfortable saying that Paul here doesn't speak about Jesus as God. He speaks about only the Father as God and Jesus as the Lord. And I believe that often when Paul uses this term Lord, for him it means an intermediary to God. And what's interesting is that David Stern, in his commentary, in his Jewish New Testament commentary, I'm going to quote what he says. I found it very interesting. He says, "The Father is the final source and the final goal." Not Jesus, he writes. It's the Father who is the final source and the final goal. And then he writes something fascinating. David Stern says, "At the close of history, even Jesus becomes subject to the Father." So he seems to be, as far as I can see, falling short of this idea of Jesus being absolutely equivalent, the same as God the Father. He seems to say, at least at the end of history, Jesus will become subject, subordinate to the Father. I believe that as far as Paul's concerned, that was always the case. But again, I think I'll wait for other passages in Paul's writings where it's a bit juicier, that we can get into this topic a bit more. But I wanted to move back to the main theme for tonight. But anyway, be that as it may, verse 6 in this chapter is a bit of a question mark in terms of what Paul's getting at. And again, it doesn't require me to say this. We know that later on in the Christian Bible, I believe it's Peter, if I'm not mistaken, writes that many things that Paul wrote were confusing and not easy to understand.
Right.
So I think when Paul writes about the nature of God and the nature of Jesus, he to me is, he could have used a good editor, someone with a big stack of red pens to help, make what Paul was writing clearer. So back to our question for tonight, which is, what's the deal with meat or food that was offered to idols? So again, Paul seems to be saying that there's no real problem with it. Now, I would stop right there and say, really? There's no problem with eating meat that was offered as a sacrifice to idols. First of all,
Right.
if we go back to Acts chapter 15, which we covered in this series, Acts chapter 15 was the first debate in Christian history and church history, right? That was the whole discussion about what should be done with all of the Gentiles that are coming to faith through the ministry of Paul. What's going to happen to all those Gentiles that are joining this Jesus movement? Because it was pretty unusual, right? If you remember from Matthew and throughout the Gospels, Jesus said, I am only here for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he tells his followers to go out and spread the word, but he says, don't go to the cities of the Samaritans, don't go to the cities of the Gentiles, right? Jesus basically curses out the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 and says, we don't take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. I mean, the Gospels have basically the entire movement of Jesus focused exclusively on Jews. It's only after his crucifixion that, I think in Matthew 28, that they claim that Jesus himself gave, after he was resurrected allegedly, the Great Commission to now go out and make disciples of the entire world. And so now, a number of years later, Paul's been running around, the Greek and Roman world, spreading his message about Jesus. And all these Gentiles are coming to the movement. And so in Acts chapter 15, this is the big question. What's supposed to happen with these people? So there were people within the movement who were saying, look, if Gentiles want to join, they have to convert to Judaism. They have to get circumcised, and they have to observe the 613 commandments, and they have to become a Jew, like every other Jew. And then they could become a Jew for Jesus, so to speak.
Right.
That's what was being voiced. Paul obviously was freaking out about this. Paul was not happy with this, and so the debate was given over to James to resolve. James, as we know, was the leader after the crucifixion of Jesus. James was the brother of Jesus, and he led the movement for about 30 years. Until the 60s. And so, not the 1960s, but the 60s in the first century. So, basically what James decides, he declares that these Gentiles coming into the movement do not have to embrace Judaism. They don't have to get circumcised. They don't need to convert. They don't need to observe the 613 commandments. He basically says that they have to only observe certain things, and one of them is to refrain from eating meat that was sacrificed to idols. So the very thing that Paul here says, no problem. Really, he says no problem with the meat offered to idols. But this went directly against the ruling of James in Acts chapter 15, verse 29. Now, it also goes directly against what God himself said. If you go to Exodus chapter 34, so Exodus chapter 34, verse 15. So God says, don't seal a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. Don't make a covenant with the people in the land that which you will be going into. And God says, and they will stray after their gods. So if you make a covenant with them, which means you get too buddy-buddy with them, you may come to stray after their gods and slaughter to their gods, and he will invite you, and you will eat from his slaughter. So God here is very concerned about not entering into a covenant with the people in the land that you'll be going into, because it will lead to you eating from the sacrifices that this person, these people, are bringing to their gods. Meaning that, this, as far as God is concerned, is a serious problem. To eat from the animals, to the meat or the food that is offered to, idolatrous service. So for Paul to say in this chapter, there's really no problem with eating this food, it's really impossible to square with either God's revelation in Exodus or with what James ruled in the book of Acts. But let's conclude now, because this is not what Paul really ends up saying in this chapter.
Okay.
If you go back earlier in Corinthians, I think back to chapter 2 and chapter 3 in 1 Corinthians, Paul spoke about, mature Christians and Christians who were immature, who were not quite mature. And, Paul speaks about how he has to relate to different believers in different ways. If I'm not mistaken, we may have had something similar back in Romans, but I couldn't remember exactly where it was. But Paul has written before about the fact that there are Christians that are more mature in their their spiritual life, and yet there are some that are, I guess, baby believers or immature believers. And so what Paul says basically in this chapter is that even though there's really nothing wrong with eating food that was offered to idols, but Paul feels that it may be a stumbling block for immature believers, immature Christians. Now, it's not really clear exactly how it is a stumbling block. Some of the Christian commentaries to this chapter say that the problem would be this, that Paul is saying the reason it's not a problem is because these idols are nothing and they're insignificant, and therefore they really can't change the status of this food. But if an immature Christians feel that maybe there is something wrong with the food that was brought to these idols, maybe somehow deep down inside the immature Christian is not so sure that there's nothing to this idolatry. So then if they themselves will come to, follow the example of people like Paul who are allegedly mature Christians, and these immature Christians will start to eat from these foods that were offered to idols, so they in their own minds will be doing something that they themselves feel is inappropriate. Meaning that, again, what Paul is saying is that if you're a mature Christian and you realize that idols are nothing and therefore the food offered to them, there's no big deal, so then the person doing that, eating those offerings, will not be affected in any negative way. But Paul seems to be saying possibly that the immature Christian, who's not so sure about whether these idols are nothing or not nothing, and if they start to follow the example of the mature Christians and eat from the food offered to these pagan idolatrous deities, they may feel uncomfortable deep down inside, meaning that they're going to be doing it, but deep down inside they're not sure whether it's right or wrong. And what might happen is Paul feels that it'll be a disaster for these people because it'll dull their conscience, right? Because they'll be doing something which they really feel deep down inside is wrong. So it's sort of a cognitive dissonance, and yet if they're doing something that they know is wrong, it dulls their moral sensitivity, and it may lead them to other sins. Other commentaries look at this differently, and they say that it might lead for these immature Christians to actually even slip back into idolatry, meaning that they're going to be eating the offerings that were brought to these idols. It might get them sucked back into idolatry altogether. This is what the HCSB Study Bible writes. If a weak Christian saw a knowledgeable one eating in an idol's temple, they may get confused and assume that those gods are real, so they too may begin to eat again in pagan temples and possibly dragged back into that kind of idolatry. So that's another way in which some of the commentaries see the potential problem here. And so for that reason, right, because you don't want to make the weaker Christians stumble, Paul says maybe even though there's nothing wrong with it, maybe it's not a good idea. Just for the sake of the weaker Christians, maybe it's the kind of thing we shouldn't do. And Paul says at the very end of the chapter in verse 13, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Now, it's not clear if Paul's saying here that he's become a vegetarian and he never eats meat at all, or if he means that I will never eat meat offered to idols. It's not really clear to me. But Paul basically is taking a bullet for the team, and he's saying that since I don't want to make anyone stumble, he says I'm not going to eat meat, whatever that means. I think most of the commentaries say that he really means that he won't eat meat offered to idols, not that he's giving up meat altogether. But the important thing that I wanted to stress tonight is that Paul is not staying away from this food because it's wrong. In his mind, it's not wrong to eat food offered to idols, but because it just might lead to weaker Christians stumbling. But to me, that's a tremendous spiritual failure on the part of Paul, because it's very clear, at least from God's point of view, as expressed in Exodus chapter 34, and in the view of even James, who was a leader of the Christian world after the death of Jesus, it is totally wrong to have anything to do with anything that was offered to an idol. And so that's more or less this chapter.
Right.
As I told you, it would be short, and next week we will move on to chapter 9.
Certainly. And as we've covered before, I mean, Paul tends to be speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I mean, like pretty continuously, whether it be because he's got a different audience, or maybe he's not sure, and maybe through his time scale of all these letters he's written, maybe he's slowly modifying his own beliefs as he goes along. I mean, we don't really know, but one thing's for sure is that it certainly most cases has a pretty heavy contradiction to Torah in most cases. So that's
a good point, by the way. Because look, Paul claims that whatever he teaches, he's getting from Jesus. Except we saw last week there were one or two times where he says
marriage.
He didn't get it from Jesus.
Right.
But normally Paul consistently claims that he is receiving revelations from Jesus consistently. That's what Paul claims. I would, seriously doubt this.
Mm-hmm.
My feeling is that Paul is making this up as he goes along, and therefore, I mean, he might believe that Jesus is speaking to him. I mean, there are all kinds of, people believe many things. Doesn't mean it's true. But I personally do not believe that, Jesus, after his death, was communicating with Paul at all. Paul, we also saw, he doesn't just say that he was hearing revelations from Jesus. He also, at one or two places, says that he also received revelation from God himself, which to me is another good proof that he didn't think Jesus was God.
Right.
But I would take your statement just now that he really is making this up as he goes along, and it could be one of the reasons why he's not 100% consistent in what he teaches, because again, he there are different pressures that are being brought to bear on him, and maybe experience has some effect on him. I mean, who knows what kind of things led Paul to teach what he's teaching. But I think that you're making a good point that he's basically someone, I think, that is rubber stamping his own spiritual intuitions with this rubber stamp of revelation.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that you'll find that he's not really thoroughly consistent in what he teaches.
There's something to me. It's interesting. Within the Christian circle themselves, Christianity will, when they hear a pastor prophesy something dynamic, like the end of the world's going to happen because this sign, the double blood moon, and all this other stuff, and this is going to happen, and to someone they looked up to, and then all of a sudden it doesn't come true, and then all of a sudden they're mocking this guy because he said something that didn't come true. But Jesus did this very thing, and they still stand on what he said, right? And so as you go through all these spoken things that are just, they're just speaking it on the fly on the seat of their pants, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. I won't mention who it was, but I heard this one person had justified buying a new car with the money that they were given because, and it was one of the new Toyota Priuses or whatever the Prius is. It's like 50, 60 miles an hour, 50 or 60 miles per gallon gas tank because gas prices are going up and they're going to keep going up. And that was the whole thing. It says, God showed me that the gas prices they're just fixing to go on the increase and they're just going to keep climbing. They're not going to come back down. Well, what happened? They went up a little bit and then they came way down. They stayed down for quite some time. So, but these people still put their faith in these people, and according to Torah, when a person prophesies something that doesn't come to pass, they're a false prophet. So why do you want to keep hanging on to this set of teachings? And throughout the New Testament, you see these examples happen where things are spoken and they didn't come to pass, and it's like, but they still bank on that because of faith, because you're told to believe without understanding, and very rarely have I ever sat in the front of a pastor and when they're discussing things like this, and very rarely will they ever point somebody to go back and look what the Old Testament says. I honestly don't think most of them even know what it says. If they do, it's in block form. It's like a little, screenshot here and a screenshot there, and it's a sad thing because, I mean, I was there for a long time and it took me a long time to get past that point to actually start studying this thing out for myself. One thing I love about how you teach and how Rabbi Singer teaches is don't take my word for it. Look it up yourself, I don't know if you saw the post, but a couple of days ago, me and my daughter, while we were at Walmart, and me and Sarah had run outside to go put something in the truck, and then we came back, and there was these people selling the little wooden crosses, and these guys, I'm guessing, when you find these people outside of Walmarts, I think they're like people who are either out of rehab or maybe they're coming to, somehow or another, they're fresh for the most part, unless they're like one of the higher ups. And as I was talking to these two guys, they were literally floored by what I was showing them, and I've had them look it up themselves. He had his Bible. I said, you look this up. I mean, and read to me off the page of the book that is so trusted, and you tell me what it says. And they were like completely like blown away by it. They were like, oh my God, that's really creepy. And it's like people who are new to Bible thinking are so much more open-minded to seeing truth things than people who were told their whole lives that this is what you believe and you don't question it, So it's unfair. It's very unfair, actually. So, Rabbi,
okay.
it's been a very, as short as it was very pointful, and as usual, it's very good to hear you express these things and all the thoughts that you have on this. You're very you think really, really deep on so many things, and we really appreciate your time that you spent with us. So, thank you, Rabbi, for your efforts.
It's great being with you.
Yeah, thank you. You as well.
And look forward to seeing you next week, I will.
I'm looking forward to it. Hashem willing.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, have a great week. Have a great week, Rabbi, and Shabbat Tov to all you viewers out there, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד